Welcome to my channel where I discourse and recommend books that I find interesting of any and all topics, and I try to do this in a spoiler-free manner. Today I am discussing Modern Occultism in Late Imperial Russia by Julia Manhurst. Hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And it was published in 2012 by Northern Illinois University Press. Now, the book is interesting for a variety of reasons. First, the edition. I always like going through the edition before I discuss the contents, which is the most important aspect of any book. It's a hardcover. It actually uses a piece of a newspaper article in Russia during the First World War, where it has the Kaiser kind of backed up by the devil. Now, this one in particular was printed in a weird way backwards, so I don't know if it was this particular edition or all the editions. But if you look at the spine, it's basically backwards. Again, doesn't matter, but it's interesting. So when it comes to the premise of the book is about how occultism and spiritism started to get involved in the culture and politics of Russia, specifically late Imperial Russia. So we're talking about prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, so the events prior to this time, which is primarily World War I and a little bit before that. Now, giving a context, it is interesting because the phenomena of spiritism and these kinds of movements, and occultism in particular. Occultism is quite old, and I will review books closer on the topics, especially Cornelius Agrippa, for example. That's a great book to review and study. It is a classic, and it's very influential when it comes to the perception that modern people have on occultism. It is directly related to that book. But in general, when we talk about occultism, we're talking about any movement that is heterodox from the normative Christian orthodoxy of European culture. So this could be in relation to things like experimentation on the causes of metaphysical or spiritual events like hauntings or miracles or appearances, or point is anything related to the unexplained was usually addressed as a supernatural event. And again, I'm not judging whether it's true or not, but the point is usually there's different explanations. So you have orthodox explanations at this time. We're talking about late 1700s, early 1800s. And you have heterodox versions of this. So occultism usually will have an answer to this. In the case of a lot of occultists, it was more experimental when it comes to trying to figure out what these things were. And then you have the phenomena of spiritism, in which they would do a meeting where they would call on spirits, and this is the classic seance. You've probably seen movies on this topic, but they would do a seance, and then the spirits would move chairs and levitate tables and scratch at doors. And one book that's very interesting about this is the biography of Houdini, because Houdini was a huge debunker of spiritism. He disliked it, and he actually went out of his way to go and disprove, demonstrate that they were using strings and trickery and kind of classic kind of showman magician kind of tricks to make things move around. But it was very impactful. In this book on modern occultism in Imperial Russia, it actually goes into that particular dynamic of how that influenced Russia. At the end of the book, the author clearly states that in in her opinion, almost all occultism in Russia was a Western-influenced phenomena. It ended up being an issue in the First World War because people were accusing anyone that in any way was related to occultism as being a foreign agent. So that was an interesting political dynamic in the book that is discussed. But spiritism and haunted houses were deeply embedded in the perception of what happens after death. And the church had answers to these questions, and spiritism is basically providing an answer. Now, the book does go into the notion that a lot of this has to do with an upper aristocratic cultural milieu in which you have the upper classes kind of experimenting with heterodox ways of understanding death and understanding life after death. So anyway, I don't want to go give you more because it goes into the topic of the book too much, I think. But it will give you a perspective, a clear perspective on how occultism and these things were actually pretty well received, meaning a lot of these experiments were not suppressed. You had newspapers and you had periodicals that discussed occultism and spiritism, and the church might address them, and the culture at the time might address it, but they were not suppressed, which allowed a lot of creativity and a lot of diversity when it comes to these ideas. Now, this changed during the war, the Great War, as it was called at the time, because the occultic movement was seen as decadent. So people who participated in the movement, they experimented with occultism, were seen as unpatriotic. They were seen as supporting the West in particular, and they were seen as, and a lot of occultism came from Germany too, so that obviously affected the viewpoint. But it became to be associated with kind of like an upper class decadent thing. It's very interesting because these days there is a similarity with that. Most people in the modern world associate occultism with elitism and a lot of strange kind of perverse behaviors of their elites, and they associate that with occultism. So it is very similar to our current situation. That goes in cycles again, because you did have, and the book actually goes into that, where you have the common people experimenting also with occultism, but at sometimes it's also associated with the elite. And if you have a negative view of your elites, then you have a negative view of occultism. So very good book. A lot of notes. So a lot of the book is filled with notes and references. So it's like a white paper, and but it's good because it gives you a lot of the sources for these things, and it has a few pictures, a few images from the time for the for their newspapers, and so it adds a little texture to the book as well, which is interesting. But it's a really nice topic. If you read books on the Tsar at the time, if you read books on the Bolsheviks, this book would fit in nicely in there to give you a perspective on how the Tsar started to be seen as decadent, and Rasputin has to do with this. And later at some point we can review a book on Rasputin. There's many books on Rasputin that are good, but it's more the esoteric kind of experiential nature of occultism that gives it a interesting spin. For example, I haven't seen occultism be so impactful in American politics, for example, as it was in late Imperial Russia. So that gives you a notion of how in Russia there was actually a lot more freedom of the press and flexibility when it comes to these kinds of topics. I'm not talking about every topic, of course, but they were a lot more willing to consider these ideas, these spiritual ideas. And I have really good books by Uspensky. That would be also a great topic because Uspensky has a very creative, very interesting, the fourth dimension, this kind of thing. It's very interesting to discuss, again, philosophically. And he's influenced by these. And obviously Blavatsky is mentioned in the book and the impact it had. But Spiritism in particular, I think it's interesting because it had such a powerful impact across the world for a long time. It's a kind of phenomena that shows up, everyone was enamored by it, and suddenly everyone dismisses it and disappears forever. And it becomes almost like a joke, like people were nuts because they were participating in this. So it's interesting to see how impactful and how powerful it was and how it influenced Dostoevsky, for example, Tolstoy, and I'm talking about just in Russia. But it impacted a lot of people in the West as well. A lot of authors, a lot of great classical, what we call classic literature, has Spiritism in there. Their viewpoint on death and their viewpoint on what happens after death are deeply influenced by this. So just thinking about that is very interesting. So a good book, I recommend you read it if you're into this topic in particular about occultism in Russia. Not a lot of books. I think it's the only book I have that actually explores this idea. Anyway, thank you for joining us, and remember to subscribe, share the video, comment on the video if you like it, and I'll try to continue providing content of this sort. Anyway, thank you for tuning in.